Seems like we're missing some people from class. I'm going to try to use the microphone, see if among other things I can wander around the class a little more instead of getting stuck here behind the computer. Okay, and this is one reason I may have to reiterate this later, but one of the problems of team teaching a class is coordinating things. And as you saw last week, Godzilla and I are not totally coordinated on when you're to do your presentations. And she's changed it again. So you're not going to start presentations until the 22nd of May. So it won't be next week. It'll be like 2 weeks from today, I think. But this is the bad news for most of you. She wants to do a whole bunch on the what'd she say here? On the 22nd, she wants 2 groups, so that's about what we would have had to do anyway. So the first 2 groups will present on the 22nd, but then she wants 3 groups to present on the 29th. She's actually going to be in charge of class on those days. She needs to leave town for Hari Raya. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Sorry, Muslim holiday. Later in June, and wants me to take those classes. So she wants to replace. So she wants me to trade. So on the 22nd and on the 29th, I will not be here. She will be here, and she's grading the presentations anyway. So I will end up having a couple of extra days. I will be here on the 12th and 13th. I thought my last day would be the 6th or whatever, a week earlier than that, the 5th. No, it'll be the 6th, yeah. But instead, I will be here on the 12th and 13th because she's taking those other 2 days. Which means, I guess, I'm not going to object too much if you give me your story on that week of the 12th and 13th, since I'll be here anyway. But do have them here by then. And then I'll start grading. That will then be my job for the rest of the semester, is grading all your papers. So obviously I don't want to take the whole semester to do it, but I will try to grade them as quickly as possible and get them on to the student newspaper. Okay, any questions on that? So I want to get that on the video in case anybody is late. Tell your friends if they get here late. So 2 presentations, the first 2 presentations on the 22nd, is that what I said? And 3 presentations on the 29th. So that will get us through about getting close to, well, however many it is. A good share of the presentations will be done so that when she takes over, she can probably back off. I don't know. She may continue. She doesn't. She's supposed to put up a schedule on Moodle, so you can check the Moodle site to see what the rest of the schedule will be. I suspect that if she's going to do 3 and 2, or 2 and 3 on the 22nd and the 29th, 2 presentations on the 22nd and 3 on the 29th, that when she does take over the class, then she will probably get them done fairly quickly. So those of you who thought you were going to have until the end of the semester probably won't. But I have not seen her schedule. So probably on the, what would that be then? So on the 19th of June, she will probably be having, another 2 or 3 of you of the groups doing it, and maybe also on the 21st. I don't know. She may just wrap them up just as quick as she can. I don't know. She's supposed to put up a schedule on Moodle. So everybody clear on that? So team 1 and team 2 on the 22nd of May, and teams 3, 4, and 5 on the 29th of May, and probably then you have a break until the like I said, the 19th, I guess that is, and then she'll probably have several teams doing it on the 19th of June. So there's a little bit of gap there between between when teams 3, 4, and 5 present, and 6, 7, and 8 maybe. I don't know. So that's the best I can tell you. She just sent me an email this morning with that change, and so that's where we're at. Okay, again, any questions with that? Sorry to jerk you around with it. It drives me a little crazy. But I am sure that when you'll enjoy her as a teacher. If you haven't already had her as a teacher, I think the students all enjoy her, and even if she's frustrating me right now by not getting the presentations lined up. Okay, well, I wanted to, we've so far in the class, we've done some discussion on interviews. When I went through the chapter 3 of the crash course, we talked about different ways of the interviewing process itself, how to kind of build to a peak of your most difficult questions, and then kind of drop down again, leave them not too upset with you. And we talked about other things around it, about how to come up with ideas. We talked about how to prepare yourself so that when you go into that interview, and again, my chapter 3 was based on interviews with investigative reporters, and I'm presuming that most of your stories here will not be that intense. They will probably be pretty relaxed, and you're not trying to trap anybody with your questions or anything. That should be fine. I also, we've gone through some of the writing process, including last week. I wrote a story in front of you. It might have bored you, but I was trying to make sure that you understood as well as you can how to put together a story. I find, I'll be frank, but last year I taught the editing class, and the editing class should be one of the latter classes you take, and I did have them do a writing assignment right off the bat, and I was quite disturbed that they can't write better in journalism. And I know some of it may be obviously the language, if English is not their first language, but I don't know if I don't know if disturbed is the right way, but it was obvious that most of them would have a difficult time getting a job in an English environment. Let me put it that way. They might be fine if they're going back to China and doing their work and stuff. That may be fine, but a lot of them were not prepared yet to compete in the real world in English. Let me put it that way. And so, which is not too dissimilar to what I faced when I was in Kazakhstan. The students there primarily speak Russian as their native language. Some of them Kazakh as their native language. And so coming to an English-based university, they also struggled. And so we actually started classes at KeyMap University, where I was at. I think we had 2 classes in Russian. So they had a broadcasting in Russian, and I think they had a writing in Russian class that we created because we realized most of our students were going to be working in their own country. And they'd probably be writing in Russian. So there is going to, so that was important that they tune up their skills, specifically in Russian, to compete in their local environment. So it's when you come to an English-speaking university and that's not your native language, a teacher needs to give you a little bit of a break on that, and I understand that. And I have been doing it for 10 years now, so that's 11 years. But be that as it may, as a teacher of journalism in English, I was concerned that the editors were not ready to be good editors because they were not ready to be good writers. You can't really be a good editor in English if you're not a good writer in English. And so I'd say I mostly emphasized in that class using desktop publishing and how to lay out pages and write headlines and stuff like that. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to their grammar skills in the stories they wrote. That was a small part of the grade. I did insist, I did grade their headlines when they misspelled words or use bad grammar in headlines. Because I figured, you're not doing that many assignments, and so altogether for the whole semester, you may do maybe 20 headlines, which are not even complete sentences. And if you can't, get some help on the internet or whatever you need to do to use proper grammar on 20 headlines, that's a problem. So I did grade them somewhat harshly on bad grammar and spelling and headlines. Okay. Anyway, so we've been going through all of that, and I said that my purpose in that last class was to help you see a story the way I see it. As I look at my notes and try to organize my notes, what are the different subjects we're talking about? What kind of order should I be creating this story in? What is the whammy? And since I have two sources, in a sense, I have two whammies. But then I choose one for the lead and then one fairly high in the story to emphasize, to get people's attention, to get them interested in that story. And so that's what I was trying to help you understand, and hopefully that will help you as you do your story. Today I'm going to go back to the subject of our class, which is interviewing, and talk about some other nuances of an interview. So, what is an interview? These are some definitions you might use. Conversation to elicit information. And that is important. That word is chosen very, very carefully, conversation. You're not a police officer. You're not grilling them like, tell me the truth or you're going to go to jail sort of approach. That's not the way you approach, even if the person you're interviewing is somebody you want to go to jail. Your most effective way of talking to them is not threatening them and berating them or something like that. So, and I mentioned a couple of times in my career, I've gotten mayors removed from office. I did not do that by threatening them. I simply listened to them. I conversed with them, and they told me stupid stuff that they shouldn't have told me. And my job as a reporter is to report this stupid stuff they told me, which was just stupid. Or and then they complicate it in both cases by trying to lie and saying they didn't tell me that stupid stuff, but I had it on audio tape in both cases. So they said stupid stuff, they lied about saying stupid stuff, and I had proof that they said stupid stuff. So that was pretty much it for them. So, and as I mentioned in the past, if you take a conversational approach, you can put a tape recorder right smack in front of them, and they will still say stupid stuff. And I sometimes wonder, why are you this stupid that you're saying stupid stuff to a tape recorder? But part of it is that you're conversing with them. You trying to maintain some eye contact with them. You're chatting with them, if you would. And then they start bragging about something that they shouldn't be bragging about because they have bought into the idea that you are their friend. And in essence, as a reporter, that is, even as an investigative reporter, that is what you are trying to do. You're trying to set up this feeling that you are their friend, even though they know better. They should know better. They're stupid not to know better. And remember, you're not their friend. You're the reporter for the local newspaper, for the local TV station. You're not their friend. But you want to help them think that. Because that's your best weapon, is get them talking and saying stuff they shouldn't say as a politician or as a criminal or whoever they are. Now that's the worst side. Again, most of your stories aren't going to be with people that are going to say stupid stuff that they're going to get them thrown into prison or kicked out of the university. And I'm not sure, even if they said something that's stupid, that we'd want to do it for this class, because there would be ramifications for you, not only to them but to you. But nonetheless, I'm teaching you so that you can become professionals, and that's the reality of a professional, is that you don't know always where your story is going to take them. In both cases with the two mayors, I had no idea they were going to tell me stupid stuff. I was just conversing with them when they told me their stupid stuff. But I also was conversing with, I mentioned the guy who blew up the banker's car. I was also just conversing with him, and he told me the truth. And that which was, I mean, I guess that's the stupid stuff sometimes people say is the truth. And so he told me the truth, and you know, obviously, I think he wanted to. He kind of blamed his attorney for turning the situation negative. That he really didn't want to tell a false narrative, which his lawyer did, and the 60, the most popular TV show on in America at the time, picked up and spread across the whole country, was a lie. But anyway, so it's also a multidimensional human conversation. It is not just words. You should understand that verbal and nonverbal communication, unconscious things, just, as you're talking to them, in some cases you can tell by the way it is part of the conversation, but you can tell frequently when somebody's lying to you or when they're trying to, make themselves better than they really are, that sort of stuff. And so you have to become quite kind of a psychologist at the same time to understand what they're really saying between the lines. You have the words and you have the non-words. You have the words and you have the verbal and the non-verbal. And even within the verbal, you have nuances and inflections and things that you're paying attention to. And so you know how to pursue the story. As I mentioned previously, you're looking for the whammy from the start of your conversation, your interview. You are looking for your whammy, and you need every time if they say something that's really interesting to you. And I emphasize that because the only way you can be a good reporter is have good gut instincts, so to speak, to have a good nose for news, as they say. You have to have good instincts. You can't. I suppose you could, if you just did what somebody else told you to do, just go do that. Go do that. But in doing that, if you don't have a good nose for news, you're probably not going to be very successful at it. There are instinctive things you need to have that are hard to teach. You need to be a major observer of what's going on around you. My wife sometimes laughs at me because I'll say, "Did you see that?" And, I'll start explaining what somebody was doing or whatever. She's amazed that I'm observing things as we're walking along, but I'm always looking, always trying to figure out what people are doing. People, I'm not going to interview them, but I'm still trying to see why would that person do that. And I said, "Did you say that person?" Da 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 da. I'm trying to figure out these human relations going on around me because that's what I'm trained to do. And she kind of laughs at me because of that, but is also kind of surprised that I'm paying that much attention to what's going on. But that's what you have to do as a journalist. It's not just the conversation, not the words anyway, not just the words. The conversation between two parties to gather information on behalf of an unseen audience. There's that doesn't amplify it a whole lot, but there is. I want to just say a few things about this unseen audience. There has been research to show the difference, and this may be more important to you as a future editor than as a reporter. But you should be aware of this too. One of the things that disturbs me right now with what's going on in America is the lack of what we used to call journalism ethics. And they're falling prey to people who are trying to manipulate them because they're not following all the ethics and the rules that we used to follow. and part of it is they have become very partisan. I'm not sure there is a nonpartisan medium in America anymore. There are, most of them are liberal and some of them are conservative. I don't know of any in between. And so that's one problem, is that they're now allowing their political biases to control their actions, which is not what I was taught, and what they claim to believe. Actually, they claim to believe that we are going to be fair and, to the degree possible, objective. They're not being fair. They're giving very one-sided reporting on both sides. Like I say, most of it is on what we consider liberal, the Democratic side in America, because they control more of the media. But also, you can't say that it's any different on the other side with Fox News and Washington Times and the conservative media. They're doing the same thing. And I've actually been in that position where I've owned a newspaper that was in competition with a liberal newspaper. And I found myself compelled to take the conservative perspective. So I wasn't nonpartisan either. Because the liberal newspaper was covering it with a biased liberal slant, and mine was a smaller newspaper. I had less space to write in. In order to balance what was going on, I felt compelled to take the conservative. I could not be nonpartisan in a sense, because they were making the conversation one-sided before I got there, before I started. And so I had to balance the ecosystem, so to speak. So I understand why it's difficult once you get in that situation to get out of it. If you want to be fair and unbiased, once this ecosystem is created of partisanship, you're sucked into it. And so I'm very disturbed about that. But so let me go back to my point. There was a study done many years ago about the difference of how a reporter would report if the reporter had a tough editor, an editor who made him be fair. He insisted that he be a fair reporter. There's a difference between that reporter and somebody who did not have a strong editor. And what they found was the reporter who did not have a strong editor took on pretty much what is happening in America right now. They saw themselves as this white knight going out to right the wrongs and to destroy the evil people or whatever. And that's how they saw themselves, even with an unseen audience. And so my point with audience is, who are you writing to? What I took out of the study was that if you have a strong editor, you in essence are writing to the editor, because the editor is the one that's going to yell at you if you don't do a good job. And so you're keeping very strict standards because your editor insists on strict standards. So in your mind, writing is a social function. So when you write, you're writing to somebody. Are you writing to your teacher? Are you writing, who are you writing to in your mind? And so in a newspaper or a publication where the editor is tough and insisting on fairness, the writers are writing to the editor. In a newsroom where the editor is not strict and is not insisting that they keep standards, then they begin writing to this, not a specific person, but the damsel in distress, so to speak, the person who needs their help, and they're going to go out and help that person in their mind. So it's not a real person. It may take on the persona of a real person. They may meet somebody that kind of takes on that role, but frequently is not one person. But in their mind, they're out, rescuing the damsel in distress, and that makes them very unfair. That just leads to non-objectivity and unfairness. So even in my book, where I cite, I think I mentioned this when we were going through that chapter 3 of the crash course, where I feel a little bit uneasy with the last of the 8 eyes, because they're saying that you need to come to a conclusion. Well, there are some times when I agree with them. I mean, if you have the facts and you have been a fair reporter, then yes, nail the bastard, whatever. You go get him. But what if you're not being fair? What if you are partisan? What if you're not objective? What if you cannot see this straight? That's a problem. And that's where we're at in America right now, is we have reporters not seeing it straight. They're seeing it through their partisan glasses. And so journalism in America is in great jeopardy, along with society, because as the media has become very partisan, they've divided America into 2 partisan groups, the liberals and conservatives. And I can tell you, I'm conservative. My sister is liberal. And when she gets on, she sees the world through the eyes of the journalist. She doesn't know anything about Donald Trump. She's never met Donald Trump, for example. She doesn't know him. She doesn't understand him. She sees Donald Trump through the eyes of the liberal reporters who hate Donald Trump, because that's the only news she watches. She does not watch Fox. She would not read Washington Times if you held a gun to her head. She hates them. And so because she never exposes herself to the other side, it becomes what we would call groupthink. I've seen that they're starting to use that term a little bit on the media in America, but that's what I've been saying that's what I wrote my master's thesis on. Is basically the groupthink that can occur when you're in this environment where everybody agrees with you. And when everybody agrees with you because you've surrounded yourself with people who think like you, then sooner or later you start thinking that has to be right. Everybody who you respect thinks like you do. So what's everybody else? They're idiots. So I think we talked early in the semester about the idea of, I know I did in the other course, did I talk about our conceptual framework? Maybe I need to. That's usually my week 1, but our week 1 was kind of crazy here. So maybe I need to resurrect that lesson to help you understand how we think and the problems we have with our way of thinking, is that we do not see the world as it is. We see the world as our mind tells us to see it is, and sometimes it's totally screwed up. And groupthink is one of those things that can screw it up. Again, if everybody around you thinks like you think, then you think they must be right. And so, when you have a radical group, terrorist or whatever, you think they think they're doing wrong? No. They're surrounded by people who think like they think, and they're convinced that what they do is right. They don't think they're doing wrong, and that's a matter of groupthink. Whatever the scenario, and that's what's happening currently in the media to a large degree, is that because the liberal media only have liberals working for them, if they have a few token conservatives, the conservatives have to kind of keep their mouth shut, or they'll lose their job because everybody else will think they're idiots. And same thing on the other side. Fox News will bring on, they have a few token liberals that they bring on to argue with them. But there's one called the Five, and so they have 4 conservatives and 1 liberal. That poor liberal, I happen to agree with the conservatives, but I feel bad for that token liberal that's on there, trying to discuss something with 4 conservatives. It's an unfair fight, and that's very typical of what Fox does. Is they bring on the liberals, but they make it an unfair fight in the process. So I will maybe tomorrow even resurrect and talk about that, about how our minds can deceive us, because you need to be aware of that as journalists. And so I might put together something a little bit new. But anyway, so you need to be aware of the traps that you can fall into. And one of them is who you're writing to. And hopefully, if you ever work for a publication, you'll have an editor that insists on you doing it fairly and not in a biased way, unless frankly, there are publications created simply to represent one perspective. That's their whole purpose in life. And so if it's partisan, they hire you to be partisan. What can you say? That's what your job is. But it is problematic when it comes to creating appropriate spread of knowledge in a democracy. That's when it's a problem. And right now, it is a major problem in America. I was just listening to an interview yesterday, and this was on a TV channel that is public, paid by the public. I think it is. Anyway, they don't really comment a lot. They do have interviews and stuff. It's called C-SPAN. So a lot of their programming is just turn on a camera in the middle of Congress and let you watch what Congress is doing, for example. And so they're trying to be very unbiased. And so if there is an unbiased medium, it would probably be C-SPAN. And so yesterday I was watching them. He brought in one of the top conservatives, a very smart person, PhD, very smart. And they open up the phone lines for people to call in and ask questions and stuff. And this gal, called up and said, "You should not have this person on C-SPAN. You're diminishing the value of C-SPAN by having this person on." Started yelling at him, and I thought that so symbolizes what's happening in America, that you don't even want to be exposed to these words by this evil person who happens to be extremely, extremely smart. And probably why you don't want to hear him, because he might actually convince you that you're wrong. So it's problematic. There are, in some cases, somebody trying to convince you. You need to be aware of this. The person you're interviewing is trying to convince you that what he or she says is true. They're not going to outright, openly confess all their wrongdoings to you purposefully. They may do it, like I said, ignorantly or stupidly, but they're not going to. They mostly will be trying to impress you, and you need to be aware of that. And so the interviewer makes it possible for the interviewee to say what he or she really thinks and feels, whether the interviewer believes it or not. And that's part of that fake friendship, in a sense. You're listening, and people like to be listened to. People love to be listened to. Maybe that's why I'm a professor. I love that I have a captive audience that has to listen to me. And so people like that. I mean, I like it, but maybe no one else does. But people like to be listened to. And so if they have an attentive listener, that's when they will say something stupid. Exactly. Because they start feeling comfortable with you, and they're trying to impress you and all this stuff. And some of that totally backfires on them. So meanwhile, while they're trying to impress you and convince you that they are, they were sent from heaven or whatever, you're learning something worthwhile to share with your audience. And what you learn is not necessarily what they're trying to teach you, because you're seeing it as clearly as possible. What's this person's role? What are they trying to accomplish? Why, in what way are they trying to impress me or push me a certain direction? In my mind, what are the counter arguments to what they're saying? And even when you bring those arguments back up to them, I mentioned the New York Times reporter, interviewing a corrupt union boss. He starts off with the real easy questions, and these people are saying, that you took all this money from the union funds and went to Malaysia with your secretary. What do you say about that? You go ahead and just let him respond to it. He's going to tell you, that's so stupid. I would never do that, whatever. And then, yeah, I can understand that how somebody can misunderstand, but your treasurer says that there's these receipts that he can't explain, that you were in Malaysia, your secretary was in Malaysia, and what were you doing there? Well, and so you just gradually bring out. That's why you need to prepare, is that you need to be able to know what questions to ask at that point. You're listening, you know the background, you're asking questions, you're backing them up. And as I said, that union boss that went to prison still thinks he's friends with the reporter that helped put him there. And he sends him a yearly Christmas card, because he did it in such a friendly way, that the union boss still thinks they're friends. I don't understand that quite. But anyway, so you can do it in a way that actually you can still kind of be friends, even when you burn them, if you handle it right. So again, you need to kind of prepare for that. I mentioned you need some documents, you need some observation, and before the interview, you need to know what questions to ask. In other words, and when you write the story, your documents and observations become part of your story. What you actually seen. I mentioned the Rolling Stone editor that came and talked to our group, but that's probably the main things he does when he does what he calls his live-ins. He lived with one of the top bands of that era for a month, and he said some of the stuff he observed was, for example, he was the lead singer lived in Hollywood, and he had a expensive Mercedes Benz. And as he was writing and talking to him in his fancy car, he said he was approaching a stop sign, and instead of stopping, he gassed he sped up, and he whizzed through the stop sign, almost being hit by another car coming from the side. What are you doing? They said, well, that stop sign used to be on the other road, and they shouldn't have changed it. And it kind of demonstrated to him how, and what a fantasy world they lived in. That they felt like that they were above, not just above the law of the country, that here's the stop sign, I'm going to go through it, but he thought he was above natural law. That he would not die going through and being hit by a car that did not have a stop sign coming from the side. Similarly, he taught another rock star, or maybe the same one, I don't remember, but he kept again, by just being around him a lot, made him feel very, very, the rock star feel very comfortable with him. He pulled out a big photo album of all the women he had slept with. And, that led to discussions of, are you afraid of getting venereal disease, AIDS or something? And, he was just oblivious to what could go wrong if you slept with 1,000 women. So, I think, as I remember right, he did not use condoms. He didn't like condoms. So he was putting his life in jeopardy to sleep with 1,000 women. But somehow he had this delusion that he was above natural law, not just human law, but natural law, because he was rich and famous. Obviously, you need to think about your 5 W's and your H. And try to pursue those. As I mentioned before, sometimes you purposely, you're going to write a story that you don't need the when and where, and you just leave them out. because they're not, because you're writing a timeless piece and they're irrelevant. You're covering an issue. And so you leave them out on purpose. But you need to think this through, and you need to think it through early on. How am I going to approach this story? Is this a timeless piece, or am I tying it to something? Because that could affect how you ask your questions. And again, those sorts of questions, what happened, who was involved, where did it happen? So in that sense, yeah, there's a where question there, not where is your interview taking place, but you start looking for details that makes it kind of, even though that's a what, who, and where question, all of those were really kind of how questions. When you add them all up, you're getting a picture in your mind of how something occurred. And so even even though they may start with a what, who, or where, what you're really getting after there is how did this happen? And same in that case, if you're not talking about your interview, if then the when and why and how, all those things become important. Certainly, if you're talking about something that occurred. And again, just you need to be thinking about all the questions. Now, these are, well, let me put it this way. These questions are not eliciting very much comment. Whereas how and why questions are, by their very nature, open-ended questions that get people talking. Some of the other questions, like I said, that the why would, but when did it happen? One word answer. What happened? One sentence happened. Who was involved? One sentence. Where did it happen? One sentence. They will probably, in many cases, go ahead and continue talking, even with those questions, especially if you're silent. One of the most important tools you have is silence. There is a need to fill this space, and the person being interviewed feels that need. You are being taught right now not to respond to that need. Don't feel like you need to talk. Listen. And they will become uncomfortable and they will fill the space with their words. And so one of your most important tools or weapons or however you want to look at it is silence, because that they will talk. But you still need to be armed with some open-ended questions that will require them to say more than one sentence in response. And because there are some who are very good at just giving one sentence or one word answers. So you need to be prepared for that. They actually are quite uncommon. Finding people that will only give one word answers is uncommon, not common. And so, but the more silent you are, the more you just listen, the more likely they're going to talk. They will feel uncomfortable and fill that space with something. And again, that is part of what, in my interviews with those mayors, I was just there listening. I don't think any question I asked should have caused them to tell me something embarrassing or to lie about it later. I don't think I asked any question that would have elicited that, because in both cases I was not expecting that. I just was silent in most cases. I let them talk, and they finally got around to a subject that they shouldn't have talked about. So again, some more of the 5 W's. As you go into your interview, have some of these ideas in mind, and of course the 5 W's. The idea of the 5 W's in part is to just off the cuff make you remember, what questions do I need to ask? I need to know the 5 W's at least. And so again, in some cases, purposely eliminating them in the sense of where and when you had an interview, that aspect of it. But other details that you're talking about, you definitely need to use the 5 W's and H. And make sure you've answered those questions. You don't want to get back to your office and find that you failed to get some information. That's kind of embarrassing. In this day and age, it's usually fairly easy to correct that with an email. And hopefully you also have their mobile phone number so you can call them real quick. As I mentioned in chapter 3 of my textbook, it doesn't hurt to even make a phone call when you don't have a question. Certainly as you're going through your notes, you may realize you failed to ask a question, in which case you need to ask that question. But even if you haven't noticed any big gap in your information, it doesn't hurt to call your source and say, since our conversation of the day, have you had any more ideas on this, and like give them a little space to think about it. And that follow-up phone conversation or email conversation may provide you some important information that you hadn't thought about. I don't know if you've ever, I presume everybody has had an important conversation with somebody, important to you, and you've relived that conversation in your mind a number of times. You as a reporter are likely to be one of those conversations for that person. They're going to relive your interview because they know that their words are going to show up in a newspaper or on TV or something. And so they know that. And so in their mind, they're naturally going to relive your interview several times. And so if you call back later, they may very well have thought about some new things to share with you, because they would like in their mind to reinvent that conversation in a sense. Oh, I should have said this, I should have said that. And so calling your source or emailing them later is not a bad thing to do, even if you don't think you left anything out. You might get some more information that could be helpful to your story. What I started saying didn't, is do think of the questions ahead of time, but don't be tied to your questions. Don't feel you have to ask every question you wrote down. And this again is where you have to listen very intently, because if you hear that whammy, if you hear something important, you need to pursue it. It doesn't matter whether you wrote down, it doesn't matter whether you even thought about the issue. For you to not pursue that subject that hit you, wow. If you say wow to yourself, you have to pursue that subject with more questions. And so you can't be tied to a list of questions once you get into the interview. The questions are there to back you up. If things aren't going, if nothing comes out and jumps out at you, then you go back to your questions. But you should be prepared to follow whatever angle comes up that you did not anticipate, which almost always occurs. Again, just another example of questions. So who was the victim? What was stolen? Where? I mean, these are basic questions, and yes, obviously they're important. When you get down to the last, to 5 and 6, however, those are the ones that get interesting, and that many reporters don't adequately pursue. Why did the burglary take place? Was the burglared property in a wealthy area? Is the victim, how rich are they? What's their occupation? What do they do? Why this place? And how did it happen? Sometimes the how can, if, for example, there's been movies about cat burglars that, creep up into the roof and find a way in, through a skylight or something. I mean, the how can be quite interesting. A burglary is when you don't actually see the person. If you see them and they threaten you and take your money, that's a robbery. And so a robbery can even have more interesting elements that you can describe. So anything that, we talked before when I was talking about news values, this idea of suspense and so forth. Crime stories are filled with opportunities to create some suspense in your story. So again, you want to go after those why and how questions that make it more interesting. Way, way, way too often, a crime story leaves out why and how. And that's where I was mentioning where, a very short story can become a novel to somebody else, such as In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, where it became like an 800-page novel because he just kept asking questions and going to new people and so forth, of something that he felt there was something here that people would want to know. Why did this person go kill this family of 5 or whatever, however many people were in that family out in the middle of the Kansas prairie? What happened? There's just going on. There's something here that people will want to know. And as the more he got into it, the more he realized this is bigger and bigger, and suddenly had 800 pages to tell the story on. As far as techniques, again, you need to be confident. And a shy person can be a good reporter. But a shy person may be writing down more questions ahead of time. They may be using their tape recorder. They may be doing some things, to try to back themselves up because they recognize that they are shy, or what we might call introvert. I'm introvert, so I know. I have to back myself up sometimes. I have to think this stuff through. I have to imagine my situation. I have to push myself when I really don't want to be in a social situation. I have to push myself because I'm an introvert. I'm somebody who's very happy to sit behind my computer, all day, writing and reading and interacting on my computer. I'm an introvert. But I'm an introvert who was not satisfied being an introvert. I felt like, I needed to do something that an introvert cannot do. So I forced myself not to let the world pass me by through my introvert lenses. And so I know it's possible for an introvert to push themselves out. Now, some introverts who don't push themselves will become good editors. They're good writers. They even know the principles of good reporting. They just don't like doing reporting. It's like being a salesperson or whatever. Some people can teach you about it, but they don't want to go do it. It's hard for them. They're an introvert. You can be a good editor and be introvert, but you can also be a good reporter. But you do have to push yourself a little bit. And so some of these things we're talking about and writing down your questions and so forth. Actually, I think being an introvert in some ways helped me be a reporter because I wanted to listen. That's more natural. I didn't want to converse. In some ways, I wanted to listen. And I would be interviewing somebody who wanted to be heard. And so I naturally gave them silence and let them talk because I'm an introvert. So it wasn't really by planning. For me, it was just natural to approach it that way. But nonetheless, you still have to, even if you're faking it, you have to act confident. You need to, of course, let them know who you are. And, if you're setting up an interview, you'd do that ahead of time. But depending on the circumstance, at some point, obviously, they do need to know. There are exceptions. Some reporters have won Pulitzer Prizes by more or less doing the live-in, like like I was talking about, except they don't let people know they're living in, that they're reporters. They might, if they think a meat processing plant is not sterile, is not taking, if they have some reason to think that this meat packing plant is not sanitary, and that what they're sending out could even be dangerous, that the working conditions might be dangerous to the workers, whatever that is they suspect, they might get a job as a work, in the meatpacking plant. And so now they have put themselves into the middle of the story, and observation becomes very important. But they are also talking to people, getting comments and so forth. So that's a possibility. I mean, that is not a bad approach, but you need to understand that that is unusual. Let me put it that way. In most cases, you're being honest with them, and you're telling them who you are, and so there's no deception in it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some circumstances where deception is appropriate. Anyway, ask clear questions, obviously, and listen to the answers carefully. Recognize a good story when you see one. So that goes back to what I was talking about. It really begins before you go to the interview, certainly. As you do some prior research, and I mentioned some of the ideas I had were from other publications, maybe from a national publication. I decided to do it locally. So you have this feeling now. This is a national problem. How about where I live? Is your question to yourself. So you have a reason to think if this national magazine is publicizing it as a national problem, gee, yes, this is a good thing to approach. See what's going on here, and that's. Like I say, I end up writing a whole series of stories in Tampa, Florida, because they had major problems, what we call, override problems with major public projects like bridges and stuff like that, where the contractors would bid one price, and then they'd say, oh, we can't do it for that price. We need this much more. Oh, we can't do that price. We need this much more. And in some cases, the price of public projects more than double. Much more than double. That's why just recently in California, they have spent literally billions of dollars on a train system. I think it's supposed to go from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And the governor just said they're dumping the whole project after spending billions of dollars because the cost overrides. The cost just went up and up and up, and their contracts allowed the contractors to get away with that until they just said, we're done. We can't spend any more money on this. So they have an unbuilt, they've spent billions of dollars on a project that will apparently never be finished. Bizarre. But there are bizarre things that go on every place. You don't understand how in the world could this happen. They happen all the time. So in recognizing a good story, look for them everywhere. As I was talking about my wife laughing about my observation capabilities and tendencies, because I'm thinking all the time about that sort of stuff. And so certainly, I think I mentioned the other day, I mean, probably the most important decision you make is what story to write, because that shows your nose for news, so to speak. When that first job I had, they had already hired a couple of reporters. They were so boring. I should have fired them, I guess. They had no nose for news. The stories they wrote were boring. They're just boring. And we only had a very limited amount of news space. So anything that was interesting, I had to write myself. They just had no nose for news. One had worked in the military, and the U.S. military has its own newspaper. But you have to be very careful about what you write in the military. So you have to be, you have to always question, am this going to get me in trouble? Because you're in the military. And so he was the most cautious reporter ever. Never wrote anything with any controversy whatsoever. And the other gal was mostly doing stuff oriented towards women, social page and stuff, and her stuff was pretty much boring too. So anyway, you have to have a nose for news. You just have to be successful in this business. Let me go. Now that last one, number 7, extract lively quotes. I'm not sure extracts the right word, but you again are listening for them. By the way, I guess this is important. I don't think I covered this. When you're taking notes, I have told you that most direct quotes are not exactly accurate, and that's just the truth of it. They're not. When you check yourself with a tape recorder, you think you wrote down some notes and you listened to the real thing, you weren't exactly accurate. But that passes okay, as long as you didn't take them out of context and so forth. They're used as direct quotes every day in every newspaper in America. And as I've said, I'm very good at it, taking notes, because I take very careful. As a student, I took notes all the time. I was one heck of a note taker, because I believed, and I still believe, that to get an A, the most important thing you do is listen to your teacher, because he's going to tell you what's important to him. And so you take notes on what he says, because that's going to show up on a test or someplace. That's how he sees things. And so you're not just taking down information, you're out psyching the professor, because he's telling you what's important. And so I always took very, very careful notes. So I became a good note taker as a journalist, partly because of my approach to being a student. And so I've had lots of praise heaped on me, even when I didn't use a tape recorder, and even when I really knew it was not exact, that they were amazed at how well I covered the conversation or the meeting or whatever. But when it comes to extracting lively quotes, yes, you do want to ask questions that might extract quotes. I mean, I don't know about lively. That's kind of a weird word to put on here, and I'm borrowing this PowerPoint from somebody else. I thought it pretty much covered what I wanted to cover. But so but more importantly, get back to what I said, that as you're listening to somebody, you will not be able to take down everything. If you don't know shorthand, as I talked about the other day, the special speed writing, you cannot take down everything. You can't do it. And in fact, in order to get any quotes at all, one thing I have to tell my new reporters that I'm teaching how to be a real reporter. In some cases, they've never taken a journalism class. I have to explain to them, which I do in my crash course also. You cannot be a perfectionist as this as a reporter. You can't feel that every word, you have to get down every word, because what will happen is you'll get down nothing. Well, very frequently a new reporter will hear a quote, and they'll start writing down the quote, and they'll get about halfway done writing down that quote, and they hear another quote they like, so they start writing down that quote. But then they hear something else, and so before finishing that quote, they go to another quote, and they start writing down another quote. What they end up with is about 40 half quotes. What the heck do you do with 40 half quotes? And so I have to tell them, what you're doing is you're gathering bricks and mortar to build a house, so to speak. You're not gathering half of a brick, and no mortar, or a little bit of mortar. We're going to use paste instead, whatever. You have to have bricks and mortars to build your house. You have to. And so realistically, it's better for you to come out with 5 complete quotes than 20 half quotes. Those half quotes do you almost no good. They're half bricks. They're broken bricks that you're trying to put this house together with. It's not a good house if you're using broken bricks. You need some bricks. And so come back with some complete quotes. Now, it may be that after your conversation, after your interview, that you can go back and fill in some of those. If you do it quickly enough and can think back, like, what exactly did they say? It probably won't be exact, as I said. But even when you're doing it, when you're writing so fast and you're trying to keep up with what you're talking about, a lot of the sentences you write down, even at that moment, are not going to be exactly. You're going to miss a word here. You're going to miss a word there. But as long as the intent and the concept, as long as again, I go back to what I said. As long as they don't know that you misquoted them, then you're close enough. You've got to be close enough if they don't know that you misquoted them. And so if it's just a word here and a word there, they're not going to know. They relive. I told you they're going to relive that conversation. So it's not like it's not relevant to them, but they are not going to remember every word that they said because they were busy thinking about what to say. And it gone on quite a while, and you know, they have all this stuff going on. They're not going to remember every word. And so as long as you're not as long as your intent is right and most of the words are right, they're not going to know that you had one word wrong or something. And if they did know, they wouldn't care as long as you expressed what they wanted to express. They wouldn't care. It's when you don't express what they wanted to express, when you didn't get the ideas right, is when they appropriately complain. And in fact, by the way, some reporters, especially if they're biased, will purposely take words out of context. And they will purposely try to misrepresent what you were trying to say. And they do that all the time with Trump right now. They're all the time misrepresenting what he's trying to say because they're trying to, gotcha. They're playing gotcha journalism, which is not good journalism. It's not ethically good journalism, let me put it that way. They may be doing what they want to do, which is please their audience, but that's not good, ethically good journalism. So be realistic about what you have to do to write a story when you're done with your interview. You have to have complete quotes. But it may be, in a half an hour interview, you have, if you have 6 complete quotes and they're pretty good quotes, that might be enough for your story. So at least get those down. Now, the more you understand that, the more you recognize that need, probably the more quotes you can get. And the better you are at it. And the less you are a perfectionist, the less you insist on having absolutely every word right, when nobody does, frankly. As long as, like I said, if it's right enough that the source can't tell the difference, it's right enough. I'm being honest with you, and probably a lot of professors would, I'm going to have a heart attack. That's the reality of the world in journalism. That's just the way it is. Very few people are word perfect. It does not, in fact, like I say, I'm more meticulous than most. And I will use a tape recorder in order to try to make it as accurate as possible. I'm also better, like I said, I've trained myself to take notes very, very accurately. But even at that, when I go back and compare my notes to my tape recorder, I know I'm wrong. So you have to learn to live with that. You're not going to be perfect, but be as close as you can. And then those, some cases you're just writing down a few words to remind you what they said because you didn't have time to get a complete quote. And so, indeed, you may have started those half quotes. You might leave some of those half quotes in there. Now, there's 2 things that you can do with a half quote. One is just remind yourself what they said and make it an indirect quote. So it doesn't really, it doesn't matter that you didn't get the full quote because you got an indirect quote. You remember those few words remind you what they said. You can make it into an indirect quote. There are also, you can use some partial quotes. So you can write an indirect quote and maybe 3 words out of it, you put quote marks around. That is then a partial quote. That still gives a little bit of credibility, still gives, you don't make partial quotes out of stuff that doesn't, isn't important, isn't interesting. But if there's something in your partial quotes that is interesting, exactly the way they phrased it, then go ahead and make a partial quote. Use those 3 or 4 words in with an indirect quote that you've been able to remember from the half quote you did take. Okay, anything else on that? So again, that's probably one of the most important things I teach young journalists, whether they're students or people that wander into my newspaper and haven't done it before. They have to come back with the brick and mortar. They have to be able to build their house, and so they have to be realistic about it. And a number of my reporters who have never been trained in journalism, never gone to a university in journalism, have won journalism awards for their work. So that's one reason I wrote my textbook, my crash course, the way I did, is I'd already started writing it down for my for my reporters who had not had any journalism training. I needed to give them something to help them get going and to be a good professional journalist, even though they had no journalism training before that. So again, I've already kind of talked about that. To plan things out in advance to the degree you can. And as I said, there's some where you don't have anything planned, and those can turn out to be some of your best ones, as long as but you can't, if you're going to have a conversation, an interview, without knowing where it's going to lead at all, in other words, kind of like a personality profile, that person needs to know that. Because they're going to think you're a very weird reporter if you don't know what, if you're asking very, very vague questions or stuff like that, asking about their childhood or whatever. They need to know when it is that you're not coming in with a very specific interview, when you basically are doing a profile. Now, your profile might turn into, you may actually, you may decide you're a liar, because your profile may turn into something more than a profile. I don't think I've really had anybody feel that way about me, but it's possible. If you go in doing a profile and they say something very newsworthy, that ends up on the front page. That's no longer a profile. If it's bad, then they might feel like you've somehow been unethical in that process, but you have to live with that. You didn't anticipate it. They gave it to you. Obviously be punctual, be professional. Research as much as you can to have some idea where to start with your interview, even if it's a profile. During the interview, again, listening is one of the most important things. Empathizing. What's empathy mean? What does it mean to empathize with somebody? You know that word? Compassion. Yeah, you kind of feel like they feel. You exhibit that you're feeling what they're trying to express to you. You're not just listening, you're feeling it. And it's like you feel sorry for him. You feel sorry for him. No, not very sorry exactly, but somehow you're feeling how they're feeling. That that you're understanding more than their words. Now that can end up that because you're exhibiting this sense of empathy, could be exactly when they tell you something they shouldn't tell you. And that's again where some people can't handle being a real reporter, because they feel like they've done something evil to hurt that person. It's also one reason why later on in the semester we'll talk about beats, and I'll probably reiterate this when I do. Do you know what a beat is? You heard about news beats? That's basically your assignment. In a general sense, that you're going to, you may be given the news beat of just covering the police department. That's your news beat. And so everything that relates to the police, you write that story. So you hang out a lot at the police department because that's your beat. You may have a news beat for education, so you spend a lot of time at schools and stuff. And so a news beat is basically an assignment that is, in some sense, geographic, But it's topical and to some degree geographic because you go to a certain place to get your information all the time. There's a lot of good things about beats, and most newspapers assign beats. But there's also a good reason why every so often they change people's beats. Why do you suppose they change people's beats? And why that's a good thing? What's the problem if you're covering the police department every day for 10 years? What's the problem with that? What do you think? Think about that. There's good things about it. You know people by name. They trust you. They might give you some information. They might not give you otherwise because they perceive you as a friend. You've been around it for a long time. So what's the problem with that? The problem is you're a friend. Then you can no longer report on them objectively. And indeed, you may choose to not report on them objectively because you don't want to ruin that relationship. And so if you're on a beat too long, that could be one of the worst things a newspaper can do, is you have now turned into a PR person, in a sense, because you're trying to maintain your friendship with all those people you got to know over the last 10 years or whatever. And that is one of the things one of the parts of those 8 eyes, people may, and why some people can't handle it, people may hate you because you told the truth. I guess that's actually one reason why it may be easier for an introvert sometimes to be a good reporter, because introverts don't tend to be as socially sensitive. They might actually be awkward in social situations that they can overcome. They can seem not awkward. So that doesn't need to be a problem, but they won't care as much if they hurt somebody's feelings, probably, because that's not in their nature. They're not that sociable to start with. And so as an introvert, that maybe is why I could burn a couple of mayors and get them removed from office, because maybe I'm insensitive by being an introvert. So I don't know. I just thinking that as I'm talking here. But regardless, it is a problem if you are too sensitive, and it's a problem if you become too friendly with your sources. And so beats are important. They're great ways of organizing things, and they're great ways of screwing up your reporting if you leave people in a beat too long. And yet you don't. It's hard to know where to draw that line. At the daily newspaper I was at, there was one gal who had been on a certain beat for maybe 20 years. She had so many good sources. She had so much good understanding, and this was a tough area. This was a nuclear reservation. So she had to have a scientific understanding of what was going on in this nuclear reservation. A reservation is an area with different nuclear facilities. So they had a power generating plant run by a private company, and they had a research facility for somebody that's, at least some of their work had to do with nuclear. Some of it might not, but at least some of it did. So they were situated in that nuclear reservation. It was where they created some of the enriched plutonium, enriched uranium that was used in one of the bombs that was dropped in Japan in World War II. So this whole reservation was quite large, partly for protection, for security's sake, and I don't know, it was isolated out in the middle of the desert, basically. So they took a whole big area and put their different nuclear facilities around that big area. So this reporter had become a specialist in this. So how are you going to replace her? So you get in a situation where it becomes a quandary. Kind of what we say, excuse the language, but damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't replace her, she becomes everybody's friend. If you do replace her, you lose her expertise. So it becomes one of those things that a newspaper has to think really hard about. But the problem is when you become everybody's friend. That can be a problem. Again, I think the second part we also pretty much covered, to plan it, to research it. I would say one other element, especially for me as an introvert, but for anybody, it's good to imagine it. Imagine ahead of time your interview. You planned it, you researched it. Now think about how you're going to conduct this interview so that it'll go smoothly. And then, listen and empathize, get them talking. Certainly dress appropriately, which is not always the same. When you wear a shirt and tie, I would say most of the time, as a reporter, I would wear a shirt and tie. Not usually a dress coat, but at least a shirt and a tie. But not always. It depends where you're going. If I'm going to go sit down for lunch with them, I'd probably wear a shirt and tie. If I'm going with the one mayor that I got, kicked out of office, we were just going to go drive around in his car and look at the city and talk about what's going on in the city. I don't remember for sure, but that might have been a situation where I'd be dressed more like I am now. Not bad, but casual, because I wanted him to feel casual. I want him to feel at ease. So there's sometimes when you want to look the part of the professional, and sometimes when you want to look the part of the friend, casual dress. I suppose under certain circumstances, it'd be odd. I could see if you're going to go interview somebody on the beach, for example, for some reason, wearing beach clothes would be appropriate, but that's not going to be very often. So appropriate, my point is appropriate is not always the same. It's not always a suit. The last one, maybe most of this is kind of redundant to what we've already said. The last one here, listen and record. Don't argue, judge, show embarrassment, ask questions. I think should be ask questions in a logical order. Even then, asking questions in a logical order, yes, that makes sense. And I'd say that's generally true. But there are circumstances, again, where that's not true. If it is a casual conversation, if you're trying to make it particularly conversational, if you don't have a specific subject that you're really focusing on, then there is no logical order. It's a conversation. Conversations take you all over the place. So you may dwell on one subject for a while, and then suddenly it changes. You go on something else, you come back. So logical order is not always true. Don't argue, judge, or show embarrassment. Yeah, I think again, in today's reporters, I've watched a lot of White House press conferences. They are getting increasingly argumentative because they know the cameras are on and they like to perform in front of the camera and try to ask some profound or whatever question to get something out of the president when he's not even there. There are circumstances where it might be appropriate, but generally it's not very effective. Generally, the conversational approach is more effective, even if you're out to get somebody, so to speak. Again, as you're listening as you ask questions, you're listening. You are, as I mentioned, listening for just the right quotes, and that's where it is hard for a beginner to not jump to the next quote. The next quote is something that they thought was really good, but they thought that about the last quote, and so you have to resist that that inclination to jump from a half a quote to half a quote to half a quote to half a quote, and recognize you need some full quotes. And so you have to kind of blank out. You need to kind of blank them out and sacrifice. Hopefully, when you get done writing your direct quote, and again, you might leave some words out and stuff. You write enough of the words that you know what they said and recognize again that it's not going to be probably absolutely word perfect anyway. So you may skip a few words like and the. You can skip, stuff like that. You can skip some words and still fill in the blanks later and make it a direct quote. But you have to, unless you're absolutely sure that this new thing they're talking about is more important than the last thing you're talking about, you need to resist it. You need to capture that quote in your mind as best you can and get that written down and sacrifice. And then when you get done writing down the quote, then you can write some indirect quotes out of sort of information of what he said after you kind of blocked him a little bit. So it's not easy. You have to, and it's hard to teach you how to do this. Maybe we could have you interview each other or something and practice in that sense. And maybe that will be something I'll do in the next week or so. Have you practice on each other, seeing how good a notes you can take and experience what I'm talking about. Because if not, you could go into your interview and really screw it up. So let me make note of that. I'm going to do that. I can leave the other topic. Come tomorrow. We're going to do an interview. What I'm going to expect is, I'm going to expect your notes. I want you to give your notes and let me see them. Not really for grade, and maybe I won't ask for them, but you need to understand. You need to look at your notes seriously and ask yourself, could I write a story from this? Because that's the question you're confronted with when you interview a real person, not each other. A real subject is, can you write a story from it when you're done? And that's where you have to learn to control yourself a little bit and sacrifice some direct quotes because you simply don't have time to get them all. Again, I've already talked about it. Silence is golden as a reporter. So don't you feel the need to fill the gap, the silence, because you're using that as a tool to get them to fill that gap. You should do this consciously. Be quiet and let them talk. And if it feels uncomfortable to you, well, it's also feeling uncomfortable to them. And that's so it's kind of the game of chicken. Have you ever heard of that? In America, we call a game of chicken like two people driving the car right towards each other to see which one will turn first and not have an accident. I mean, it's a stupid game. It could kill you. But it's kind of, in a sense, that's what you're doing with your silence. You're trying to outlast the other person. You can out-silence the other person. And so you're both feeling a little awkward if there's a big gap and no conversation going on. That's okay. You're using it as a tool. They will give in first, and they will start filling it in. So silence can be great, especially if that silence, if it's purposeful, then that means you've been talking about something important, and now you're just silent because you want him to keep talking, or her, as the case might be. You want them to keep going on that subject. Now, if you have a pertinent question, follow-up question to get them going again, that's fine. But it's also possible just simply to be quiet. They've been talking about something important, silence. They will start talking again. So don't rush to fill in that gap. Use it to your advantage. Keep an open mind. And that's part of being a fair journalist. Don't go into, the last thing you should do is go in and presume that you know everything. I like to it's one of those things I didn't talk to you guys about, I guess, but I love to watch videos of quantum physics. And I do that because they absolutely blow your mind. Quantum physics basically, they tell you things like, that time doesn't exist, that some of the quantum physicists think that we're somebody's video game, basically, that we don't exist, that we're not real. They're coming to this conclusion because the universe is too mathematical. They're saying it can't be that mathematical by accident. Somebody had to do the programming. It's too mathematical. And so there are actually some scientists in Seattle, Washington, being given grants that are, I think they have more than $1 million in grants, and what they're trying to do is try to catch the programmer taking a shortcut. In other words, if you create a computer game, the computer person in that, your characters cannot have all options. They cannot have every option, an infinite amount of options. That you can't program that. You can't program infinity. And so if somebody's programming us, they think we can catch them at taking a shortcut once in a while. But they've spent several years and they haven't caught the programmer yet. So, I'm not saying we are computer games, but there are serious scientists in quantum physics who think that's a possibility, that we don't exist, that we are somebody's computer game. I very much resist that idea. For one thing, we do seem to have an infinite number of choices. What I teach in my other class of success strategies is that that if we're proactive, we can change our destiny. We can choose anything we choose. And that would be hard to do if we're a computer game. But my point is, I like to watch these videos because they challenge my thinking. And I want to, it doesn't mean I'm totally unbiased in my reaction to them. We all have come in, as I'll explain sometime in the future, with our conceptual framework, somewhat controlling what we see and perceive and understand, even what we hear. Is controlled somewhat by our conceptual framework. And like I say, I'll probably handle that next week. But so we need to be challenged once in a while. We need to keep our minds open enough that we can accept that maybe we're wrong. If you're going to be a good reporter, and like I said right now, I'm not sure there are any good reporters in America anymore. But if you're really going to be a good reporter, you need to accept the fact or the possibility that you're wrong, that you don't know everything. And it may lead you in some interesting directions that you did not anticipate. At the end of your conversation, your interview, it is always good to, is there anything else that you'd like to add, sort of question. And that's where I was saying you might even reiterate that sort of a question a couple of days later if you're not on a strict deadline with a phone call or an email or something, because that person has been thinking about your conversation for the however long it's been since you ended the conversation. Because to them, your conversation was important. And so they're remembering it. They're recalling that conversation over and over again, saying, oh, I should have said this or I should have said that. And so you call them up again, you may get some really good quotes because they've had a lot of time to think about it. Now, they may try to, you need to be careful of that because they may have thought and said, I said something really stupid. I should not have said that. Well, don't let them manipulate you when you call them back up. And I haven't really had a chance, since they don't know what you're going to write, they usually don't know what they need to correct. And so they unless it's really honest. In some cases, they really did honestly misstate something or whatever. And you need to probably take them at their word. Not always. There are possibilities where you're pretty sure that maybe they talked to their lawyer or something and decided to try to fix something that they should not have said for legal reasons, for example. Part of your assignment is to take photos and always think picture. Never forget the picture angle. We actually, more and more in journalism, people are being asked to take their own photos. Because in America, for example, may have mentioned this, but newspapers have lost 2/3 of their advertising over the last 10 years. And so they're hurting financially. And they're cutting staff. One of the first staff members to get cut is photographer, because they can always hand a camera to a reporter. And so reporters are more and more being asked in America to take their own photographs or their own video, by the way, since most cameras also do video, and most, at least the bigger newspapers, are also doing an online version. Then the video can be very important too. So more and more, probably not to the extent that they should. In fact, I've done some research on this, and I wrote something called "How to Save the New York Times," and then something kind of like that as a book chapter. What they need to do to survive now that they're losing all this advertising. And one of them is to become more multimedia. They have to make their online version. In fact, what I say, their online version should be more interesting than their newspaper, than their publication, if they're a newspaper. They need to add stuff that they can't put into it. For example, video. They need to be doing video, sticking it on their website. They need to give people a reason to go to their website, because right now not many people are going to their websites. And the only way, the way a newspaper makes money, I think I did tell you this, you're paying for an audience's attention. So if the people do not go to your website, you cannot sell advertising there, because that's what you're selling, is people's attention. And right now they're not doing a good job. They're selling very little advertising on their websites. So what's that tell you? They don't have people's attention on their websites. And so you have to do something to get their attention on your website, and you're not doing it by just putting your newspaper on the website, because they like that newspaper. They're used to that newspaper. So they're not going to the website unless you give them something different and interesting that you can't give them. For example, it would not be hard for any newspaper, let alone the New York Times, to have an occasional debate or an actual, a video-based interview or a video-based discussion with experts on some world crisis or whatever. You might be able to go ahead and write a story from it. If it's a good story, go ahead and write the story. But the story is going to be the short version. Your long version's on the internet. And that's why, if somebody's interested in that subject, you tell them in the newspaper, for the complete discussion, go to the internet. You need to think multimedia, you need to think internet, and most newspapers are not doing that adequately. So yes, take pictures, because you need that for even the printed newspaper. I think I showed you some pictures that I took, some of the papers that I published, and how I'd go to a conference and might take 400 pictures, and so the one you see on the front page is my best one. But I took 400 pictures at a conference to get that best one, basically. So don't be shy to take pictures. Definitely come back with something, but think about the variety of things you could do in taking the pictures. Maybe as you're done with your interview, maybe then you do have the interviewee get out of the chair and show you something, whatever, depends on who he is, and get a couple of pictures of him walking around the government building or whatever, and showing you stuff, whatever it might be. So try to get him more than just a head and shoulders if possible. Definitely, as I was saying, you need to learn from your mistakes. And so how to capture your notes and stuff is one of those I learned because I made mistakes. I came back with half quotes when I was younger. So that's how I know to tell people, don't come back with all half quotes. Can't do anything with them. You can't write a good story with half quotes. So yeah, learn from your mistakes. Obviously be polite and courteous. And again, they've used the word empathize. There are some types of interviews that are a little bit different. I mentioned one that I'm not really saying this here, but it's reminding me that in some cases you can take news from another source, and you start, then with a phone call, you can do a very quick job of a story by doing a quick phone interview. And if you've taken information from another source, like in my case, I was a weekly newspaper competing against a daily paper, the first question is, I presume you read the story in the Tampa Times today. Was that accurate? All that they say is yes, and everything in that story becomes available to you because now they've confirmed everything in the competitor story. So you can actually say, he said thus and thus because that's what the Tampa Times said, and he said it was accurate. And so he confirmed it. So, be a little careful about how you word it, but basically everything in that story now, once he confirms that it is accurate, you can use. But now you ask the other questions, and this is where I became pretty good at asking the how and why questions, because as I realized that the daily paper was not asking how and why. And so I would call up the fire department when they, after a big fire or something, and ask those additional questions because the daily paper just asked the who, what, when, where, and not the why and not the how. And so with a very quick phone interview, I had a better story than the daily newspaper did that I could put out in about an hour. Call it up, make a few quotes, start typing. Tip-offs, tips. I would more commonly just call it a tip. The more people, and this is again where we're talking about beats become good in some cases. But even if you're not assigned to beats, over a period of time, you start making friends with people, you start meeting people. And even if you don't know them, one of the advantages of having to be a reporter that uses social media and invites your readers to come converse with you in social media is that they can give you tips. And indeed, some of the, I have a presentation, I don't think I've ever given it here, but it's basically Twitter journalism, in which I talked to some people and also went and borrowed some from some YouTube videos and stuff. But I gathered information from real people and not so real people, or some people on video, about how they use Twitter. And one of them, the big things he said, probably the most important things I get from Twitter are, one, tips, ideas, what to write about, and secondly, I can find out who to talk to, because either the person who tweets me gives me, they are somebody who has firsthand knowledge or expertise, or they know who does have firsthand knowledge or expertise. And sometimes he said he just puts out that question. Anybody know who I should talk to about such and such? And so he uses Twitter as a way of doing his journalism, of finding sources, finding story ideas. And so that's kind of the modern way of getting tips. Now you may still get phone calls with tips. They may come in the form of an email. It may come, it comes in lots of forums. But social media is probably the most effective way in this day and age. If you can get a good following of people following your social media posts, you can also use them to help you with story ideas and story sources. a thing they call here the voice of the people is what I would call a man in the street. I think that's more typically in America what we call that. Is that you basically do a series of short interviews with just people you find on the street. And so you're taking your camera, you're taking their picture, and you're maybe using a recorder, especially in that situation. And you're just saying, you know, what do you think of Donald Trump or whatever? What do you think of building a wall, along the Mexican border? And you're taping their interview, you're taking their picture, and then you have, like, in just a relatively short period of time, and in an hour or something, you can have quotes from 10 people, pictures of 10 people, and that makes a very good story, a man in the street story. It's called Ring Arounds, the last one. I'm in the sense it's talking here, it's kind of like a man in the street on the phone. I've never done it that way, where you're just kind of randomly calling people up and getting their opinions. I'd much rather go out on the street and do it, because then I get their picture, and I can talk to them face to face. And it doesn't take very long to do a man in the street anyway. So I'd have to be pretty desperate to do a man in the street on the phone. But I guess it's possible. Following up on press releases, I think I mentioned I was pretty good at doing press releases when I did go into PR marketing, because I knew what the editor wanted. Let me just finish this. I may come back to this to finish some stuff, but I think we're pretty much covered everything. A lot of this thing is somewhat redundant, that I'm using this PowerPoint that I borrowed from somebody else. But anyway, a press release is, sent to you from somebody who obviously is representing a view. They want some publicity on something. They represent a certain organization. So you have to take whatever they send you with a grain of salt, but it's a good starting point. Even when I would send stuff in and I knew how to write journalism, and in fact, I would get on the front page, but they would not, a daily paper would not print my story on the front page. They would redo it. And so my story convinced them that it should be on the front page, but they would send out their own reporter to talk to me and talk to other sources to redo that story. So, but don't think that's a waste of time to write the whole story. I would quite frequently send out a 2-page. Sometimes they say, "Oh, you should only do 1-page press releases." Well, that depends what you're writing about, and how much information they need to convince them this is a front page story. So it was not uncommon for me to send a 2 or 3-page story out as a press release if I had done the reporting for them. Basically, if I wrote such a good story, they could not ignore it. That would get me on the front page if I sent them a 3-page press release, because I gave them all the details that they needed, and they could read it and they say, "Yeah, this is a front page story," that they don't get from most PR people. So meanwhile, put the shoe on the other foot, so to speak. You're the reporter and you get a press release. Now this is your starting point. This is an invitation to follow up. They expect you to follow up. And unless you're a really small newspaper and a very small staff, but we did 2 things with press releases at the daily newspaper, and that had a bigger staff. But first off, if it was really important, they would hand the press release to a reporter and say, go do a story on this. If it had some interesting facts, like a meeting was coming up and they thought some people would be interested in that meeting, they would give it to an intern and say, "Cut this story down to 1 paragraph. We're going to put it in the digest." A digest is a series of small stories. And so a lot of press releases they started off as a full page or 2 pages. They ended up 1 paragraph in a digest, because they really weren't that newsworthy. They were that newsworthy, 1 paragraph worth of worthiness, so to speak. We're after time. I'll just stop here. There are some more discussions here that are worth pursuing on this page, not any others. I don't know. Okay, so find your subjects, think about what you want to write about, who you want to interview, and get that to me so that you can hold your spot. And we will See you tomorrow. You're going to be interviewing tomorrow. So think about interviewing. And how you're going to do it. I've given you some warning. What I want to see is really what I want to see is if you can resist the temptation to end up with a whole bunch of half quotes. So we'll try that tomorrow.